Today we're going to talk about the space race and animals in space. So in the bottom left-hand corner, this is Nikita Khrushchev, and after Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviets had no really well-defined way for a leader to succeed him. So for the first few years, a group of leaders kind of shared power, but as time went by, one man gained power, and that person was Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was married once and had 5 children, and he was more open and more open-minded than Joseph Stalin, for sure. Like Stalin, Khrushchev believed that communism could and would take control of the world, but Khrushchev thought it could be done peacefully. He favored a policy of peaceful coexistence in which the two powers would compete economically and scientifically, but didn't necessarily need to take it to war. So, if Nikita Khrushchev had come along just a little bit earlier, we might have been able to avoid some of the escalation at the early parts of the Cold War. What's kind of interesting, though, is despite this kind of philosophy, which seems like it would lead us toward more peace, this snowballing effect of what's been set in motion is going to take a very long time to dissipate. In the competition for international prestige, the Soviets leaped to an early lead in what became known as the space race. On October 4th of 1957, they launched Sputnik, the world's very first artificial satellite. Sputnik traveled around the Earth at 18,000 miles per hour, circling the globe every 96 minutes. Its launch was a triumph of Soviet technology. Americans were shocked at being beaten into space and poured their own money into space programs. The United States scientists worked frantically to catch up with the Soviets. The first attempt at an American satellite was a humiliating failure, with the rocket toppling to the ground. But on January 31st of 1958, the United States also launched successfully its first satellite. I'm going to stop here and show you the space race's beginnings and how frustrating it was to get it right.
It had taken the Soviets 4 years to duplicate the American success with the atomic bomb. It took only 8 months for them to do the same with the hydrogen bomb.
Well, there wasn't any doubt that everybody was building them as fast as they could. We've got to build them, we've got to improve them, and keep at it, keep at it, keep at it.
The need to test the new weapons was seen as so urgent that the U.S. government even put its own troops in harm's way. Within a few months of the successful Soviet hydrogen test in 1953, several thousand American troops were ordered into trenches in the Arizona Desert. One of them was Korean War veteran Reason Wehrheim.
The purpose of it was to test the reaction of the troops to an atomic bomb. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That shot went off. You see this real bright light. With your hands over your eyes, you can see the bones in your hands. And there's this god-awful noise, it just feels like it's compressing your heel. See that? It's a feeling like you're in a vacuum cleaner, like your whole body's been vacuumed. The house that was in front of us was no longer in front of us. It was gone. Of the 2,584 men that were there, there's only 3 of us still alive.
How many Americans were affected altogether can never be fully determined. The fallout from this explosion, known as Shot Simon, reached as far away as New Jersey, among the dirtiest of the 200 above-ground nuclear tests that took place between 1954 and 1958. The same frenzied pace of experimentation was applied to the rocket program. Both superpowers saw them as crucial for the delivery of powerful nuclear payloads. American scientists were not always having much luck.
I saw the rockets that were pointed north go south, and those that were pointed south go north. I saw one go straight up in the air and explode. I saw one go straight up and come straight back down again. But never during those 100 launches did I see anything go right.
On October the 4th, 1957, someone did get it right.
They say, attention, all radio stations of the Soviet Union are broadcasting.
The first artificial Earth satellites in the world have now been created. This first satellite was today successfully launched in the U.S.
This beep, 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 what is it? Sputnik. Sputnik is around the globe. Who did it? We did. The Soviet Union. First into space.
And I can remember going out to my backyard one night, looking up at this bright streak going across the sky, and I felt a sudden sinking feeling, one of almost terror. Now, suddenly, you've got Soviet missiles that can reach into the Dakotas, can hit Chicago.
With a surprise attack possible for the first time, Americans began to look at the sky differently. Now as a place from which terror might reign. And to learn some new terms like duck and cover.
I felt that the threat to America had been increased, that the Soviet Union had upped the ante. While we were playing cops and robbers hide and seek in our backyards and our front yards, there was the gnawing anxiety that it could all end instantaneously.
So militarily, one of the reasons that the space race was so important was mentioned in the video. It gave both countries an opportunity to have the thrust power to launch an ICBM, which is an intercontinental ballistic missile, from its soil to hit the enemy's soil. So it increased the launch capacity, the range of those types of missiles, emissions. And so the space race was important for exploring space, yes, spying, yes, but also the thrust power of the launchers. As the space race advanced, people started to experiment with whether humans could survive space travel. And so I'm just going to show you a few of the animals that were launched into space in the name of science. Miss Baker rode the Juniper IRBM in 1959 in the cone nose. Actually, she's one of two that rode in the cone nose of the Juniper. And actually both of them made it back. She lived until much later on, I think like into the 1970s in Alabama. And so she survives. Her partner survives the return, however, dies about 4 days later because the electrode chip that they had put into that monkey got infected, and when they tried to take it out, the anesthesia overcame that monkey. So it died within 4 days. This is Baker. This is Ham on the right. Ham rode in the Mercury and became quite a celebrity, as did Baker.
To infinity and beyond!
A couple of the other kind of early on space stories. Laika is on the upper top left-hand corner, labeled A. That is Laika, and one of the early dogs in space, one of the first dogs in space, but not the first dog in space. The Soviets sent Laika up. I believe she was the first dog into orbit. There was never the intention of bringing her home. They didn't have the technology to do that yet, so Laika spent a couple of weeks in space and then died, and it wasn't ever planned on being returned. B, the French were the first to send a cat up in space, and you can see the electrode on Felix's head, because that is Felix. Felix became quite famous and made it onto a stamp, so you can see Felix on the stamp. Not a great likeness as part of the space race's movement forward. C is Ham. Ham became quite a celebrity, returned back to Earth and traveled the country, and Belka and Strelka are in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And Belka and Strelka are kind of a nice transition because they are Russian pups that went out into space and were recovered. And Belka and Strelka would go on to have puppies, and one of the puppies was given by Nikita Khrushchev to John F. Kennedy when he became president, and Kennedy gave that to his daughter Caroline, and so the puppy was kind of bridging the gap, a goodwill gesture between the United States and the Soviet Union by the 1960s. One more thing I wanted to tell you. About 2/3, but in the 1940s and 50s, as the space race was just in its early days, about 2/3 of all the monkeys used did not make it. There were a lot of accidents in which the animals just didn't make it, just FYI. Last piece for today. Following the rejection of President Eisenhower's open skies proposal, so he went to something called the Geneva Summit in 1955, and he proposed that countries be able to watch from afar what's happening in other countries. And of course the Soviet Union said, no, we don't really like that proposal. So following the rejection of his proposal, the CIA began doing it anyway. They began making really secret high-altitude flights over Soviet territory. The plane used for these missions is a U-2, which you see right here. A U-2 could fly at super high altitudes, supposedly without detection. As a U-2 passed over the Soviet Union, its infrared cameras would take detailed photographs of troop movements, missile sites, and things like that. Okay? The U-2 flew at such high heights they had to have a special suit for the pilots to fly in, and they had to have a special fuel in addition to that. By 1960, many U.S. officials were really nervous about the U-2 program for a couple of reasons. First, the existence and purpose of the U-2 was an open secret amongst many members of the American press, so it's just a matter of time before we get caught using them. And second, the Soviets had been aware of the flights since 1958. In fact, Gary Francis Powers was shot down over Soviet territory. And here's the story about that. Eisenhower himself wanted the flights discontinued because he and Khrushchev were about to meet in 1960, and he thought that it was kind of a show of bad faith for him to continue to do something he promised the Soviets he was not. The flight took place on May 1st, and the pilot was Francis Gary Powers. 4 hours after Powers entered Soviet airspace, a Soviet pilot shot down the plane, and Powers was forced to parachute into Soviet-controlled territory, and the Soviets sentenced Powers to 10 years in prison. What this did was, it was official evidence that the United States was continuing to spy despite the fact that they had agreed not to. So at first Eisenhower denied the U-2 had been spying. The Soviets, however, had firm evidence. Eisenhower finally just had to admit it. Khrushchev demanded an apology for the flights and a promise to halt them. Eisenhower agreed to stop sending the U-2 flights, but he would not apologize, and Khrushchev angrily called off the summit they were supposed to meet at. He also withdrew his invitation to Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union, and because of the U-2 incident, the 60s opened with more tension between the superpowers that should have been going